We'd like to thank Mainspring Companies for sponsoring Season 1 of The Next Entrepreneur. Mainspring celebrates the entrepreneurial journey, and we are very grateful for their support. Welcome to The Next Entrepreneur. I'm your host, Andrew McLindon. I'm here with our producer, Daniel Sagona, and we're happy to bring you our first episode of The Next Entrepreneur. It is our goal in this podcast to introduce you to a wide variety of entrepreneurs and hear their stories. I am an entrepreneur. I started my business 30 years ago. And over the years have grown into a family of companies. And I am just now at a point in my career where I am probably having the most fun ever in growing new businesses, starting new businesses, and expanding the services of our original companies. So I am an entrepreneur. I love what I do. I love the journey, and I have found that I enjoy talking with other entrepreneurs so much. I'm having a whole lot of fun with this podcast. So we have interviewed about 10 entrepreneurs up to this point, and we have some fantastic stories coming your way. I'll tell you my philosophy, Daniel, on this podcast. I kind of relate it to the things that I read about business. So what I mean by that is I read a lot of biographies. I read a lot of business biographies. And in many instances, you know the outcome of the story. You know that entrepreneur reached a great level of success, and that's why a biography was written about them. But in reading the biography, you learn about so many points along their journey where you're like, oh my goodness, how did they work their way out of this? How did they survive, this particular situation? And it just goes to show you that every entrepreneur's journey is one of a lot of ups and a lot of downs. It's survival, and it's growth, it's excitement. They make for great stories. Now, to contrast that to other types of business books, and I'll pick on, so for example, self-help books. And I've never been a big self-help book reader. They just don't really resonate with me, and I've never really made much headway on those. So I like reading about the stories. And in this podcast, that's what I'm aiming to do, is to tell the stories. We're not here as cheerleaders in the way that a self-help book would be, but more to share stories. So let me share a little bit about my story. I started 30 years ago in the commercial building construction business. Started with zero capital, and gradually built our business from the very smallest projects. I started my business when I was married, had 2 small children, house note, 2 car notes, and it was actually in a down market. But it was time for me to move on from where I was working previously. I worked for a mid-sized commercial building contractor, and it was my time to make my move. I was 27 years old, and so I started there, and we gradually built our business up to where we were then doing meaningful jobs in the commercial markets and building buildings and churches and schools and office buildings and hospital renovations and truck stops and car washes and gas stations and things like that. And so we did that and have done that for a very long time. But we got to a point then where our clients reached out to us and they needed for us to help maintain their buildings that we had built for them. So ultimately, we created a commercial building maintenance business, which was branded separately. And then what followed that was an automation business, which started with us working in distribution facilities, and we got into conveyor system installation. So we were the mechanical install contractors, and we've done that now for 20 years. We then got into real estate development, creating and developing subdivisions, building townhome projects and office development projects. And then we got into an equipment leasing business, which is initially focused on generator systems, but has transitioned over the years to be equipment that's used in the e-commerce industry, in the distribution centers. So we also grew our e-commerce business in other ways, and we started another company that provides facility services inside of e-commerce facilities. And then we added two companies just in the last year. One is a testing and inspection service that works in the e-commerce industry. And then finally, we started this production company that produces this podcast, that also does our marketing videos for our companies, as well as for third parties. So we employ strong managers, strong leaders, and in doing so, I'm able to go in and out of each company and give now my input from my years of experience and just having the time of my life. A whole lot of fun right now. I would say outside of that work, I should have mentioned that I'm a husband and a father of three. I have three grandchildren, and very grateful for the life that I have. And we also run a charitable project called the McLindon Family Foundation, in which we provide adaptive bikes for children with special needs. So these are children with spina bifida and cerebral palsy and conditions like that, in which the children have balance issues and they can't really ride two-wheel bikes. So we provide adaptive bikes. They're bikes that typically will have a high seat back. They may have a harness system that hold the child in if they have core strength issues. They'll have steering and braking mechanisms from the rear for the caregiver to help push and steer and guide the bike. And so we started that 12 years ago, and we have done about 325 adaptive bikes. So these bikes range in cost from around average around $2,500. So we have gotten a lot of support from the community, from friends, from foundations that have supported us, and we have a big time with that project. And I have a wonderful program manager helping me with that, and it's a real big part of what I do day in and day out. So that's where we, an example of what I like to call social entrepreneurism. So we will be talking not only with entrepreneurs in the business industry, but we will talk with social entrepreneurs, people who are doing really meaningful things, that benefit society. And so we're really, really excited about it. Super pleased with the interviews that we've done to date, and really excited about the long-term potential of this project. So, Daniel, that's kind of what I was going to start off with, and that's my elevator speech there. What else do you think we need to bring to our first-time listeners on our first episode's attention?
So I think what's interesting to me is hearing about like how the company's expanded. It seems like you started with construction and then you noticed, oh, there's a need here for this. And then that became something else. And then it just sort of, it seems like it's just constantly been growing outwards. Is that the process? Like, how do you decide, like, you've started like 10 different businesses, right?
Yeah. So the thing, good question. So the thing to me is, it's all about opportunities. And secondly, it's about branding, right? So, when you grow in a business, you would like to, continue to grow it in any way that you can. The lowest hanging fruit is to continue doing what you're doing, right? If you build buildings, continue to build buildings. But other opportunities present themselves. For example, you can then get to a point where buildings need to be maintained. And so you can, there's a second level of opportunity that's created there. So, what follows that to me, which is critically important, is branding. So there's some companies that will grow their services, but they will continue to do that under their original company name. And so that company ends up doing more and more services. I am of the philosophy that if those are standalone services, that they should be branded separately. And because typically each of those services require employees with different skill sets. And so, the guys that we have that may be building buildings or, forming foundations will be different guys than who are maintaining a building. MBD Automation is a conveyor and automated equipment installation contractor performing work in the e-commerce fulfillment centers, distribution centers, airports, and mail processing facilities. We have an experienced team of professional managers and technicians and have been performing this work for over 20 years. We've worked in 38 states for the largest e-commerce companies in the world. If you have received a letter, package, or parcel delivered to your door, it may have been processed on a conveyor installed by our team. MBD Automation is a proud supporter of the NXT Entrepreneur podcast. You want to make sure that you are communicating to your clients like this company and these guys within this company are the guys that specialize at doing what you need them to do right now: maintain your building, or install a conveyor system, or inspect your facilities. And I think that by having these different brands, to me, it's a lot more appealing, and I think it's a lot more effective in communicating to your clients. If you're the guy that tries to do everything, then that doesn't come across nearly as effectively. But each one of these companies is made up of employees that are experts in their field. So I just love branding. I love the whole process of creating and identifying, maybe is a better word, identifying the opportunities, and then what is the best way to maximize that opportunity. And I think sometimes when people think of businessmen or women, and they think that that the main goal is to make money. I in my experience, that's not really the case for most entrepreneurs. What I sense from the people that I talk to, and certainly what I feel from myself, is there is this sense of gratitude and enjoyment in like identifying the opportunity and then figuring out everything that it takes to make that happen. And usually it's this huge puzzle, and you have to work really hard to figure it out. And then that there's just comes, a lot of joy in doing that. That's the fun. Now, if you can do that and profit, then that's what makes it worthwhile. Of course, if you didn't profit, then you couldn't afford to continue to do it. But any financial gain that comes from an entrepreneurial endeavor typically is just a side benefit. I think for most true entrepreneurs. It's all about identifying the opportunities and then branding them. And to me, that's why I'm having so much fun. I just love it.
So it's more about the process.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Not the end result matters, but you're doing it because you love the process.
Yeah. Another thing, Daniel, and this is off this subject, but it's something I've thought about a lot in creating this podcast. And it's what is it about an entrepreneur that makes them tick? And I think when I think of myself, I think back of like, when is the earliest I can remember there being an entrepreneurial thought? And I like to ask our guests this, and we get some really, really intriguing answers and some wild stories. But I'll tell you mine. Because I didn't realize it until I thought about it years and years later, maybe 30 years later. But when I was about 7 years old, I was going with a friend. I was going with their family to Florida. And back in that day, we would drive along it was before the interstate. We would drive along the Coast Road, Highway 98, I believe it is. And we would go through Waveland, Mississippi. And in Waveland, Mississippi, there was a souvenir shop. I think it was a gas station and souvenir shop. And in front of that souvenir shop, there was a chain link fence that was about 8 feet wide and 12 feet long and 6 feet tall. And inside that chain link fence is this little cage. That's what it was. There was hundreds and hundreds of conch shells. You know what the conch shell looks like? They have that beautiful, polished finish on the inside. And, if you hold your ear up to them, you can hear the ocean. And as a 7-year-old, I didn't really know what they were. I knew when I looked at them, they were beautiful, right? But looking back on my 7-year-old self, what I remember thinking was, I don't know what those things are, but I don't want one. Because if they don't care enough about those things, then to just leave them outside in this chain link cage where they're all just stacked up, they must not be that special. And I remember thinking, if I was selling them, I'd have like 3 or 4 of them on the shelf inside and the rest of them in a storeroom in the back somewhere. You know? And I didn't.
That's 7.
Yeah. And I remember thinking back on that and going, oh my God, that was just totally entrepreneurial, you know? It was a story about supply and demand and, you know, how you create, you know, that sense of demand, I guess, but I drove by that chain link fence filled with those conch shells years and years later. At some point, our family had a camp down there on the Mississippi coast, and those conch shells had disintegrated. They were still in that chain link fence 20 and 30 years later. They were protected. They were right on the beach road, but they were in front of the building so that as storms and hurricanes even would have come across, you know, the beach there, they were kind of protected and didn't get flooded away or anything. And they were just a pile of crumbling mess, you know, literally 20 and 30 years later. And I was like, you know what? They never sold those damn things, you know? So I'm
sure right there on the beach, you could probably just pick them up anyway. Like,
well, I don't know. I don't really know. These were big things. These were big conch shells. They're the things I think of from like Key West or something, you know, where I think of that because they serve conch fritters and stuff down there. But, you know, I don't remember like really seeing them as I got older, you know, in those waters, but I guess they were. But look, I like to ask our guests that question of them remembering their first entrepreneurial experience. And usually I give them a little heads up on that a few days before so they can spend some time thinking about it. We've got some wonderful responses to that. I really love that. But I tell you, hearing the stories from our guests so far is just been the greatest joy for me. And, you know, from other serial entrepreneurs, you know, people who will do one thing and they'll do that for a while and they'll sense a change in the market and they'll get out and they'll move on. They'll move to a different market or a different product and change the different businesses that they're in over their career, you know, from real estate to manufacturing. And it's just fascinating. We had a fantastic interview with an artist in Croatia, a world-renowned artist, Zvonimir Mahanovic, in his studio in Croatia. And you may not think of an artist as an entrepreneur until you hear his story. Very entrepreneurial. We talked with a serial type entrepreneur in Scotland, Chris Rowley, and many other guys, CEOs out of New York and serial entrepreneurs out of Baton Rouge, and just super excited about our upcoming guests that we have lined out. So I am really enjoying this podcast. I'm really enjoying working with you, Daniel, and we've had a whole lot of fun so far. So looking forward to this first season and hearing some wonderful stories. Our goal here is to hopefully build a base of budding entrepreneurs and as well as seasoned entrepreneurs that really just love hearing the conversations from both business entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs and the things that they have done in their lives, the lessons that they've learned, the hurdles that they've had to cross, the situations they got trapped in and how they worked their way out and their successes. And certainly not trying to just tell, everything turns to gold type stories. We're really digging into the tough times as well as the good times. And, with the global recession of 2008, not that too far in the distant past, that impacts most people's stories and certainly impacted mine. But we all live to be stronger. So we are looking forward to this season getting underway, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode, which we will call episode number 1. Anything else we need to add here, Daniel, before we sign off?
I think that's it.
Okay. All right, folks, we'll see you next week.